When you hear the name Jesus, what comes to mind? Probably a calm, serene figure in white robes, preaching a message of peace and love. But the historical records paint a very different picture. A man who was seen as a dangerous rabble-rouser, a radical who so threatened the powerful institutions of his day that the authorities had him executed as an enemy of the state. So, what did Jesus actually say and do that marked him as such a revolutionary figure? This isn't just a story about religion. It's about politics, power, and what happens when one person dares to challenge both. It's the story of how a peasant from a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire managed to threaten the entire structure of his society and paid the ultimate price for it. To understand this rebel, first, you have to understand the world that made him. The world Jesus was born into was a pressure cooker. First-century Judea was a land under foreign military occupation. The Roman legions were everywhere, a constant reminder to the Jewish people that they were a subjugated nation. Roman governors, like the infamous Pontius Pilate, ruled with an iron fist, their main goals being to collect taxes for Caesar and stamp out any spark of dissent. This was not a peaceful coexistence. It was a brutal, forced occupation. On top of that political tension, you had a deeply entrenched religious establishment. The temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life, but it had also become a massive economic and political machine. A priestly aristocracy, the Sadducees, had to walk a fine line, navigating a tense relationship with their Roman overlords to maintain both the peace and their own power. Many common people felt the system they ran, particularly the temple sacrifices, had become corrupt and was just another way to exploit them. Into this powder keg of imperial oppression and religious hypocrisy steps a man from the rural backwater of Galilee. He's not a priest, not a warrior, not a nobleman. He's a craftsman and a teacher with a message that's about to catch fire across the Judean hills. The kingdom of God is at hand. This wasn't just a spiritual saying. It was a deeply political and dangerous declaration. Because if God was about to establish his kingdom, it meant Caesar's was on its way out. So how did this obscure preacher begin his rebellion? It didn't start with a call to arms. It started by breaking the rules. Jesus' rebellion wasn't fought with swords. It was a revolution of ideas, a direct assault on the values that held the establishment together. He started with the laws the religious authorities held most sacred. Take the Sabbath. The law was clear. It was a holy day of rest. But religious leaders had piled hundreds of their own picky regulations on top of it. Jesus saw this not as holiness, but as a crushing burden on the people. So he openly defied them. His followers picked grain to eat on the Sabbath, an act considered work. When he was confronted, Jesus didn't back down. Instead, he made a statement that flipped the power dynamic upside down. He declared, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In one sentence, he put human need above rigid religious tradition. He was saying the rules should serve people, not the other way around. To the establishment, this sounded like anarchy. He also shattered social and purity taboos. He was slammed for eating with tax collectors and sinners, the outcasts of his society. He touched lepers, people who were considered unclean and were forced to live in isolation. In a culture obsessed with ritual purity and social status, these were scandalous acts. They were a deliberate signal that his movement was for everyone the establishment had rejected. He was building an alternative society, a counterculture right under their noses. Then his words grew even sharper. He took aim at the pillars of society, family, and wealth. In a world where family loyalty was everything, Jesus made a jaw-dropping demand. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He wasn't just asking for followers. He was demanding a level of allegiance that trumped even the most sacred social bonds. His teachings on wealth were just as radical. "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle," he told them, "than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." In a society where wealth was often seen as proof of God's blessing, Jesus called it a dangerous trap. He was directly challenging the wealthy elites who ran the temple and profited from the Roman system. But perhaps his most confrontational sayings were those that challenged the very idea that he was bringing a simple message of tranquility. He warned his own disciples, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." He wasn't calling for literal violence. He was making a stark admission that his message was inherently divisive. It would force people to choose sides. It would tear families and communities apart, pitting the old way against the new. It was the proclamation of a spiritual and social civil war. With every rule he broke and every sermon he gave, the threat he posed became clearer. He was dismantling the authority of the religious leaders piece by piece. He was questioning the social order. He was drawing huge crowds. And the authorities in Jerusalem were watching with growing alarm. They were terrified that if they let him continue, the Romans would see it as an uprising and bring their legions crashing down on the entire nation. Their fears were about to come true, because Jesus was heading straight for the heart of their power, the temple itself. If Jesus' ministry was a slow burn, his arrival in Jerusalem for Passover was an explosion. Passover was already a tense festival, celebrating the Jews' liberation from slavery in Egypt. The air was thick with revolutionary fervor, and the Roman military presence was beefed up, on the lookout for any would-be Messiah trying to stir up the crowds. Jesus didn't just walk into the city, he staged a demonstration. He rode in on a donkey, an act the crowds immediately recognized as echoing a prophecy about a coming king. They hailed him, shouting and laying their cloaks in his path. To the Romans and the temple authorities, this looked exactly like a political rally for a rival king. But it was what he did next that sealed his fate. He walked into the temple courtyard, the holiest place in Judaism. He found it filled with money changers and merchants selling sacrificial animals, often at rip-off prices. The Gospels describe a scene of pure, righteous fury. Making a whip from cords, Jesus drove the animals out. He flipped the tables of the money changers, sending coins scattering across the stone floor. He accused them all of turning his Father's house into a den of robbers. This was more than just a protest. This was a direct physical assault on the economic and religious system run by the priestly elite. He was, in a very public way, declaring their entire operation corrupt and illegitimate. For many historians, this was the final straw. It was a public humiliation of the authorities and an act of sedition they simply could not ignore. It confirmed their worst fears. This man was a direct threat to their power and to the fragile peace they kept with Rome. The conspiracy to eliminate him kicked into high gear. The chief priests and scribes started looking for a way to arrest him quietly, away from the adoring crowds. As the high priest Caiaphas reportedly argued, it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed by a Roman crackdown. The charge they'd bring to the Romans wouldn't be about religion. The Romans didn't care about that. The charge would be political. It would be sedition. They would tell the Roman governor that Jesus Christ was claiming to be a king. What part of Jesus' story do you find most revolutionary? The way he challenged religious laws, his teachings on wealth, or his final confrontation in the temple? Let me know in the comments below. Jesus was arrested by a group sent from the high priests and handed over to Pontius Pilate. The trial was a political necessity. While scholars still debate the exact blend of religious and political motives, for the Roman governor, the situation was straightforward. A man acclaimed by crowds as a king was a potential rebel leader, and Rome didn't take chances with such threats. The punishment for sedition against the Roman Empire was death by crucifixion, a slow, public, and humiliating execution designed as a brutal warning to anyone else who might dare challenge the power of Caesar. The sign nailed to his cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, was intended as a final mockery from Rome, but it was also a stark admission of why he was killed. He wasn't crucified for healing the sick or for telling people to love their neighbor. He was executed by the state because his words and actions were seen as a fundamental rebellion against the religious and political establishment. Before he was the serene figure of faith, worshipped by billions, the historical Jesus was a radical reformer, a rebel with a cause so powerful that it threatened an empire and ultimately cost him his life. His story reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to speak truth to power, no matter the cost.